My name's Lucy Leonard. I'm an occupational therapist and director with the OT service.
I'm Adam Ferry, occupational therapist and director of the OT service. Today we're going to be talking about who would benefit from a wash-dry toilet. I suppose, Lucy, in basic terms, anybody who is having some challenges in cleaning themselves after using the toilet is somebody who would benefit from the wash-dry toilet. But alongside that, from an occupational therapy perspective, so it needs to be one of their goals. So to be able to be clean independently, to support their roles and all of those sorts of holistic aspects as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like you say, basically it's about somebody who is struggling to attend to their personal hygiene after using the toilet, but it's about getting people to understand that this product is available for people, because sometimes human beings are very adaptable creatures and they will find ways around things. So like you say, yeah, anybody who's struggling with personal hygiene after using the toilet, but also part of the sort of single-handed care approach or proportionate care approach. So if somebody's having, for example, 2 carers to assist with toileting, maybe one to assist with standing or using a piece of equipment and the other person to wipe, the provision of a Closomat toilet would assist in reducing that care, in the same way that you could even reduce the care from one person to get somebody to be completely independent.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's interesting how we start to engage the person in those conversations in the first instance, though, isn't it? It's a very intimate act. So even for very skilled therapists, the idea of going into somebody's own home, their safe space, and delving into how do you use the toilet and how do you clean yourself after using the toilet can feel like both an intimidating topic to explore, but also one that could make the client feel a little bit more uncomfortable to discuss. And I think from that perspective, I don't know about yourself, but the starting point, apart from the relationship building, which is sometimes very difficult if you're there potentially as a one-off, or you're there as somebody who doesn't have that time within the service to get to know that person really well. It's very much about how we use our activity analysis skills, isn't it?
I think it's brilliant that you've brought up about the difficulty in discussing toileting with people, because sometimes on an initial assessment you're wanting to make sure that you're getting a really good quality of information from the client, but it can be something that's really, really difficult to tackle on that initial assessment. And so, you know, we talk about toileting being quite a taboo subject, but if you think back to the lockdown, what was the first thing people bought after rice and pasta? It was toilet roll. And I think that was a really good way of highlighting the importance of toileting across cultures, especially the British culture. I think it started in Australia, the toilet roll buying, but it just shows how important being clean after using the toilet is. And absolutely, activity analysis is a way to have a look at the occupation of toileting and understand how somebody undertakes that occupation.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about using activity analysis, again, just to clarify, we're not talking about saying to somebody, okay, show me how you toilet.
No.
Because it would just be wholly inappropriate,
Yeah.
wouldn't it? What we're talking about is identifying those transferable skills and needs.
Yeah.
Looking at other activities that provide similar movement or have similar types of skill requirements. So an example away from toileting would be, you know, people might often use a transfer in and out of bed as a way of starting some kind of bathing assessment in terms of the legs being brought up to the bed, the sitting balance being similar sorts of skills that you require to be able to get in and out of the bath using certain types of equipment. And that's the sort of thing we're talking about, isn't it?
Yes.
It's looking at activities where somebody needs a certain level of core sitting balance, where their range of movement is being determined. So for that reach to be able to clean themselves, the fine and gross motor skills, how do they grip What is their sequencing like? How do they understand the task? All those sorts of more detailed elements of activity analysis will then start to give us a picture of how that person would perform the task on the toilet.
Yeah, I always think making a hot drink is a really good example of all those things you've mentioned. The cognitive function, the sequencing, those executive functioning skills, and just like you say, the reach and the bend and you know, can the person do something if I distract them by talking about things and problem solving? So just watching somebody make a hot drink will give you an idea of their functional skills, and then that may open up a conversation. If you say, you know, I noticed that you're struggling with your grip, how do you manage to hold the toilet paper? And so watching somebody undertake an activity that's not necessarily toileting can really help us identify problems with the occupation of toileting.
And that's not to say that we can't see the person transfer on off the toilet. I think moving away from activity analysis slightly, and actually it's worth mentioning that there's an excellent activity analysis guide on the Closomat website, which would recommend everybody take a look at, because it's a really good breakdown of the skill requirements for not just the transfer, but the whole range of the activity. It's a really useful thing to have a look at. Moving away slightly from the activity analysis side, we can obviously see somebody transfer on and off the toilet. That in itself is much less intimate. It's not about the act of toileting, it's about the standing and the transfer. The challenge there though is, I think, understanding the activity as an occupation rather than just a transfer. And us considering how important that is for somebody as part of their routine. Again, I'll use, moving away from toileting, I'll use something like bathing as that example. You know, how meaningful is bathing to that person? So rather than asking how do you do it, ask why do you do it? It's that slight change in questioning that goes from something being purposeful to meaningful. Now we could say that toileting has less meaning to somebody. So we don't wake up in the morning thinking, I can't wait to go to the toilet today. It isn't that kind of meaningful activity. But if we consider occupation from a World Federation definition perspective, we need the main things to pick out from that are our intervention covers need, want, and expectation. Need, I think we're okay with, we're comfortable with.
Yeah.
Want and expectation are things that are easy to be missed within that, depending on which services we work in. But also, it talks about how occupation can be purposeful or meaningful. So thinking about toileting as a purposeful activity and how important being clean is to then helping that person then engage in meaningful activity. So the fact that it's purposeful, not meaningful, is absolutely fine. We're still doing our job as occupational therapists, but it's being able to clearly identify that. So rather than just considering it as a transfer, thinking about how does it fit into somebody's routine and why is it important?
Yeah, I think as occupational therapists, we also understand as well that toileting as an occupation isn't, like you say, just the act of transferring on and off the toilet. There's other things that people do in the bathroom, so we don't just go in there to clean. I mean, some people sit on the toilet and will read their emails and use it as a quiet time and shut the door to get away from the children and have 5 minutes peace. So it's about opening up a relationship with the client and getting them to trust you and share that information about the occupations that they undertake in the bathroom and how we can support them with the intervention that we provide. I think that's really important.
So some of the things we've started to talk about there are very much about ensuring that not only is the assessment holistic and we understand toileting as an occupation in its own right, but we've started to get into a much more client-centred assessment.
Yeah, I think we use the term client-centred quite a lot, so it's important to understand what that means around the occupation of toileting. And I think for me, it's about acknowledging that people are different and not making any assumptions about how an occupation or an activity is carried out. And I always use the example of boiling an egg. If you ask somebody to boil an egg, they would do it very, very differently from person to person. Some people will boil the kettle and put hot water into a pan and put the egg in when it's boiling. Some people put cold water straight into the pan with the egg and boil the water. And there's just so many different ways in which to undertake the same activity. Toileting is the same. We need to make sure that we're not making any assumptions about how somebody carries that out. So, for example, some males will sit down to toilet to pass water if they have poor standing tolerance. Some people that I have met have had to sit on the toilet to wash their hands because of poor standing tolerance, and then will stand up and adjust their clothing. So it's about treating people as individuals and truly being client-centred and speaking to somebody to find out how they undertake toileting and how that's different to maybe your perception of how you think they may do it.
So if we're thinking about, it's a really good point, if we're thinking about the client-centred nature of toileting, and we've covered a bit of activity analysis, then actually what we're saying essentially is that if we go back to the topic in hand, that a wash-dry toilet is appropriate for anybody with any kind of hygiene need within specific roles where it's their goal to be independent. And I assume you would agree, therefore, across any age?
Yeah, certainly across the lifespan. I've worked in paediatrics with children, and I can think of many examples of where the provision of a Closomat toilet has enabled somebody to be independent, specifically working with people with autism and learning disabilities. I had one client who was 14 years old and lived with parents and very much wanted to be independent in toileting, and that was his goal because it was an age-appropriate thing to go to the toilet and do everything in the bathroom independently. Because if you think about it, an age-appropriate activity in terms of toileting, you would probably stop getting assistance from a parent at a preschool age. So the boy I was working with was 14 and very much didn't want mum to assist with toileting. So he had begun to refuse mum to assist. But what was happening was, because of his learning disability, he wasn't able to clean himself properly after using the toilet and wasn't aware that he was still unclean. And this was having an impact on his, you've mentioned it before, his social activities, because he would go to college and unfortunately wasn't clean after using the toilet. So when the referral was made to me, mum was pretty desperate, very upset about the situation and embarrassed for her son because he wasn't aware of his hygiene issues, but still refusing help from her. So we discussed the provision of a wash-dry toilet and got the young person involved, and it was started off by just showing him pictures of a wash-dry toilet, and we sort of graded it. So we then showed him a couple of videos of it working, and he was interested in it. What I had to take into account was the fact that he had some sensory issues related to his autism spectrum disorder. And so before we put the adaptation in, before we put the wash-dry toilet in, we found an independent living centre which had a Closomat toilet installed. And we went along one day and he was able to try the wash-dry toilet with his mum in the room. And the feedback was that the sensation of the water frightened him a little bit. It was a little bit of sensory overload. So again, we used a graded approach, and this is the fantastic thing about Closomat and the product specialists, because speaking with the product specialist, I was advised that they can actually turn down the pressure of the water initially. So this helped the child to use the toilet initially and just get used to it with the water pressure being a little bit lower.
As in the way of a gradual exposure
Exactly.
to the sensation, okay.
Yeah, so it was kind of like a graded approach, which fits really well with the occupational therapy philosophy. And then over time, as he got used to that, we were able to get one of the engineers to come back and just change the pressure slightly. By that point, he got used to it, and it really did meet his needs. And you know, we need to think about mum's role as well. You know, mum never felt comfortable assisting him with toileting at that age. And so it was a really brilliant way of meeting his needs and keeping him clean.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting example. Because my example would be is a working age adult who had a head injury as a child, but I didn't get involved until they were probably in their late 20s. And the referral was very much looking at vocational work, vocational intervention. College was the college you had been attending was no longer an option because of age, etc. So it was very much about how do we engage this person in meaningful work or that sort of intervention. But it became about not just work, but about planning for work. So all of those, we all know that our home life and our work life are so intertwined. Work itself couldn't just be the only bit of intervention that we had to consider. So this young man, because of his head injury, was completely independently mobile, but really struggled with the processing elements of personal hygiene. Mum was still at home, was still cleaning him after moving his bowels. And he could talk through how to clean himself, but then there was that sort of executive functioning disruption between knowing what he needed to do and then getting his body to do it in what is actually quite a complex physical movement. So we then started looking at what was available for him to be able to do that independently at home, but it had to be alongside his goal of wanting to be independent and his mum wanting him to be independent. And actually there was some reluctance from his end to be independent. So it's not making that assumption. Mum wanted him to be independent, but actually I think he quite liked still that idea of mum as carer. Yeah. So it's breaking down those roles and thinking what's in that person's best interests. What does mum want? What did he want? And we did that not in exactly the same way you did it, but something similar. And this was about making sure that when he went to work or when he went to volunteer, he was clean. What was socially acceptable was being adopted at home. And I think what's really interesting about those two case studies we've talked about there, those two examples, is that they're two very different people with very different needs in some ways, but actually with very similar needs in another. And I think that really just highlights that this is really about activity analysis. Yeah. So whether the person is young, school age, learning to toilet, or is working age, adult, and has a head injury or other neurological condition, or as we mentioned in the previous session, is aging, it's about activity analysis and how we apply that. And really that's our unique skill as occupational therapists in being able to really drill down into what can somebody do both physically and cognitively, leading to robust recommendations. And that recommendation might end up being something similar. So in those cases, they might have both ended up with the palm of either. But actually, there are elements of that activity analysis that are very similar, and there'll be big elements of it that are very different. But we come to the right conclusion for that person based on the activity analysis.
Definitely, and it's about that quality of the assessment, that initial assessment, and treating toileting as more than just a transfer. That's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the topic itself about who would benefit from, I think we've covered a fair bit. So we've talked about how the starting point is somebody who's having some challenges in cleaning themselves after using the toilet. But taking that a bit further in that it comes down very strongly to the applied activity analysis, how we start to engage people in those conversations as a starting point in something that's very sensitive and personal, how we ensure that the task is given the occupational credit that it needs, how we're seeing it as a purposeful or meaningful activity, depending on how that person communicates that with us. And then how we provide a solution for any of our clients, regardless of diagnosis, regardless of age, it's all about that robust clinical reasoning through application of activity analysis.
Absolutely, and thinking about the OT process as well, we start with the assessment and the intervention, and then we need to be able to evaluate our intervention as well. So with my example, if I'd just gone in and put the wash dry toilet in and that was the end of it, it wouldn't have worked. My client needed that graded approach in that evaluation, so that's really important as well.
Yeah, and really interesting there how you brought in the the product specialist from Closomat there as a really important part in that cog. So rather than us just, as you say, having it installed and then it's done, it's understanding the knowledge and the expertise that the product specialists at Closomat have, and the adjustments that they can make to not only ensure that the assessment is client-centred, but that the product itself is completely focused on that individual and their needs, rather than a generic product that covers all.
Yeah, I see the product specialist as, that font of all knowledge with regards to the product, but working closely with them. We're the specialists in occupation and being client-centred, so working together we can definitely meet the needs of the client.